Welcome to the Unlearning Room, a space to pause, get curious, and question what we've been taught. I'm your host, Mary Cat, though some of you may know me as Cecily May. Today we're exploring something that may feel both strange and deeply familiar. The idea that we are not singular beings, that inside each of us is a whole internal system of voices, feelings, and impulses. And unlearning the myth of being one true self opens us up to more compassion, more choice, and more presence. So settle in, take a breath, and let's step into the room together. Walt Whitman once wrote, "I contain multitudes." Dick Schwartz, the founder of Internal Family Systems, echoed this in a different way when he wrote, "Most of the emotions, sensations, images, dreams, thoughts, or impulses we experience emanate from parts." So when I say parts, what I mean is this: different aspects of ourselves that carry their own feelings, impulses, opinions, beliefs, and roles that influence our energy and perception. You know that voice that wants to rest while another voice tells you to push through? Those are parts. Or when you really want that second slice of cake, but a critical voice or harsh thought pops into your head that tells you you need to lose weight, parts again. When our parts pull us in opposite directions or choices, anger or anxiety can build. But parts can also be what keeps us organized at work or school. They can help us study for big tests. Think of specific systems you might have in place to retain new information. Your favorite color or foods you dislike, parts are behind that. Parts play a role in our experiences of joy, fear, sadness, and grief. And when we feel overwhelmed by those emotions, it's a signal that those parts have kind of taken the lead and those experiences can sort of consume us. But I'm not saying parts are bad. In fact, Dick Schwartz says there are no bad parts. They all serve a valuable purpose in our unique systems, if we allow ourselves to get curious about them. Or as Dick calls it, follow the trailheads. We can develop a relationship with those parts that feel secure and safe. But how to feel safe with emotions or sensations that currently feel unsafe? Well, that's where what IFS calls self comes in. It's a deeper, innate anchor of sorts that we all have, but sometimes we need support finding our way back to connection to it. You see, self is the calm, curious, compassionate presence or energy inside us. In IFS, healing happens not by silencing our parts, but by letting self lead and offering that energy to the parts of us that feel scared, unsettled, reactive, anxious, etc. We are all complex beings and multiplicity is the norm. We are not broken for being conflicted. We're human. And if IFS is a brand new term to you today, then pause and take a breath. It can certainly feel overwhelming when we are offered a different way of thinking. It makes sense if your brain is going into overdrive to understand this concept. What I've found to be true with clients is sometimes our thinking parts want to figure IFS out like a document or a puzzle. And that makes sense. The language is new. But the truth isn't new. Many cultures long before colonization spoke of multiplicity. Here's a metaphor I use to kind of explain self and parts. Imagine self-energy as the steady water of a creek. The parts are the rocks and pebbles. Some create friction, some redirect the flow. The water is always there, steady. If we focus only on rearranging the rocks, we miss the flow. We get frustrated, even step out of the creek in contempt or defeat. But the self is always there, patient, steady. The work isn't forcing the rocks to vanish. It's acknowledging that they are there while remembering that the water keeps flowing. Pause with me for a moment. What multitudes do you notice in yourself? Maybe the parent and the spouse, the playful side and the planner, the side that wants to rest and the side that pushes through. You see, just as the creek keeps flowing beneath the rocks, our self-energy keeps flowing around all our parts. But when we lose sight of that steady flow, our parts can take over, especially in our own self-talk when we make mistakes, as well as how we show up in relationships. That's where the distinction between empathy and compassion matters. One is more parts-led, and the other is fueled by self-energy. Many of us lead with empathy. Empathy is beautiful and a valuable skill. It's how we feel with someone in their experience. But empathic parts can get sort of swept away in the moment. Empathy often has an agenda. Beneath the desire to help someone else is the desperate attempt to regulate our own discomfort with the other person's distress. That's a part trying its best to stay in control because control feels safe, but it doesn't nurture relationships. Compassion, by contrast, comes from self-energy. It's grounded. It's intentional. It's the difference between being swept away in someone's storm versus sitting steady on the shoreline. You're still there, present, but you trust yourself not to drown. Schwartz describes it like this: distinctions between empathy, feeling with, and compassion, feeling for, is vital for IFS and indeed for the whole field of mental health. Mature empathy involves emotional resonance and an ongoing awareness of the difference between self and other inside another. And research backs it up. In 2014, Tanya Singer's lab used brain imaging to compare empathy and compassion. Empathy activated the brain's pain circuitry, while compassion activated the reward circuitry. The parts of the brain tied to warmth, care, and resilience. In other words, empathy can drain us, but compassion sustains us. Here's an unlearning takeaway. Empathy isn't bad, but if we only lead with it, our empathic parts can get overwhelmed. Compassion, by contrast, comes from self-energy. It allows us to stay present without being consumed, to witness someone's storm without being swept into it. When I first encountered IFS, it wasn't through textbooks. It was through life, divorce, parenting, and parts of me that carried shame, fear, and longing. I started to notice the different voices inside. A writing part that gave me confidence with words even when pronouncing them out loud was hard at times. A part that nerds out endlessly about dogs, a passion rooted in childhood. A rebellious analytical part that hones in on societal systems and relational and cultural patterns. A part that likes to clean the kitchen and fluff the pillows on the sofa before I climb into bed. A part that's favorite color has been blue since I was 5. These aren't bad or good. They are me. And over time, I noticed how these parts shape not just my inner world, but my relationships. You also have everyday parts. Maybe it's the part that always double checks the locks before bed, or the part that wants to people please to keep the peace, or the part that just wants to crawl under the covers whenever conflict shows up. These aren't flaws. They're parts, doing their best to protect or guide us, to keep us feeling safe. And because parts are shaped by our relationships and experiences and are universal, that's why this language has been so powerful in my parenting with my daughter. You see, this isn't just something I've practiced alone. My daughter has adopted parts language too. And it gives us a shared way to talk about the messy realities of being human without shame. If I snap at her for being late, getting out the door for school, Later, when we repair, I can acknowledge that she did not deserve my tone and it was coming from a part of me that struggles with my own time management. It's not all of me, just a part that unfairly took out its own challenges onto her. I'm still accountable. It doesn't excuse or justify anything, but it helps us repair in safety as she knows that there are also parts of me that like to have impromptu dance parties or spend time reading books to her. She also sees me pausing, reflecting, building sturdiness inside myself. And that sturdiness becomes a bridge between us. And she uses it for herself. When she's hangry, tired, or overstimulated, we can name those parts together with compassion instead of shame. It even helps with tough to navigate situations. For example, in 4th grade, she had a teacher who yelled daily. She also had a classmate at one point who would impulsively poke at that dimple on her chin. Parts language gave us a way to make sense of it, naming her hurt, angry, shocked, and uncomfortable parts, and getting curious about what parts might be driving others. Not to excuse behavior, but to remember that everyone's actions come from their own parts, and that none of it defines her worth. And this is where we can zoom out even further. How we relate to our parts changes how we relate to others, especially in the balance between empathy and compassion. And what I really love about IFS is that it doesn't just help in big moments like divorce or family wounds. It also gives us qualities to lean on in the everyday. Schwartz calls these the 8 C's. When self is in the lead, we show up with qualities like curiosity, compassion, clarity, creativity, confidence, calm, connectedness, and courage. And there are also the 5 P's: presence, patience, perspective, persistence, and playfulness. These aren't abstract, they show up in everyday life. For me, curiosity shows up when I pause mid-reaction and ask myself, what part of me just got activated? Compassion shows up when I repair with my daughter and name my own grumpy part instead of blaming her. And playfulness shows up when I let my silly side guide us back into connection after a tense moment. Creativity shows up as flexibility when plans change or a rainy day disrupts our day in the sun. The point isn't to memorize a list. It's to notice that these qualities are already in us, and they surface more when parts trust that self is leading. And when we bring these qualities forward, something else begins to shift too: our attachment styles. Because what we often call attachment isn't fixed, it's just part strategies. Anxious attachment? That's often a hypervigilant protective part scanning for safety. Avoidant attachment? A protector who learned vulnerability was unsafe and now keeps emotional distance to avoid re-experiencing familiar pain. Disorganized attachment? That's both sides of the coin, but polarized. And with secure attachment, that's what it feels like when self is leading. Not 100%, but leading and present enough. It's when our parts trust they don't have to take over loudly, impulsively, or drastically to get our attention or someone else's. So instead of labeling ourselves as broken or over-identifying with our attachment styles, we can begin to see them as strategies. They make sense in the context of our personal history, and they can shift as more self-energy comes forward. It's really reparenting in a nutshell. It gives us an internal do-over, a way to meet the parts of us that didn't get what they needed in those early years of development and to offer them safety, compassion, and leadership now. And even though IFS is internal work, it ripples into everything: how we handle rush hour, how we show up with pets, kids, partners, friends, and at work. Every context becomes an invitation to lead with presence. And when we understand that others are also operating from various parts with unique stories and wounds, it opens our hearts to more curiosity and less judgment. Multiplicity is the norm, not the exception. And when we unlearn the myth of being just oneself, we make more space for compassion, for choice, for possibility. And for me, this truth has mattered most in family wounds, places where old pain ran deep. Take my mother wound, for example. I had already done a lot of healing before I discovered IFS, but this work deepened my compassion. It allowed me to see the young parts of my mother who carried the same pain I did, without being hijacked by empathy. It allowed me to honor the parts of myself who chose healing while holding space for the grief around her parts who chose not to heal her own mother wound. Compassion lets me hold her story and honor mine at the same time. It supports the boundary I set nearly 15 years ago to not stay in relationship with her. That choice, once heavy with guilt, now feels intentional and healthy. Because compassion doesn't erase boundaries, it strengthens them. Take a breath with me here. Can you recall a time when you held compassion for someone and still needed a boundary? Notice how those two things can coexist. Can they? Or do you notice tension in your body? Compassion doesn't mean collapsing into someone else's pain or pushing your own aside at the expense of their wishes. It can also mean standing steady in your own truth. And if you've ever struggled to hold both compassion and boundaries, you know it's not easy. Which is why my former teacher, the late, and my parts all collectively agree that great, Derek Scott's teaching has stayed with me. We don't have to be 100% in self to be self-led. Even 30% matters. That means we can be stressed, anxious, mid-argument, or even repeating some old patterns we swore we would stop and still be self-led if we pause and notice. Sometimes self-led is choosing to count to 5 instead of yelling, even if our body is shaking. Sometimes it's circling back later to repair. Self-leadership isn't perfection, it's presence. So here's where I want to invite you to tap into your curiosity with a different way of thinking. Multiplicity is natural. You contain multitudes. Empathy can hijack, but compassion sustains. Attachment styles, they're just parts doing their best with methods that work to keep us feeling safe enough in our childhoods. And remember, self-leadership doesn't require perfection. Even 30% matters. I encourage you to pause this week and notice, what part of you has been loudest lately? Is it a worrier part, a fixer part, a rebel part? Write it down. Acknowledge it. Notice how it feels in your body. See if you can tap into curiosity. Thank you for being with me in this exploration. I'm still unlearning in real time between Cecily May, the brand, and Mary Cat, the self. And maybe that's the point. Unlearning isn't linear, it's layered, lived, ongoing. And shout out to my daughter, my sweet bee chickadee, who suggested I record an episode further explaining about IFS and parts work. This topic is one I love to talk about and share with others. So thanks for stepping into the Unlearning Room. If something stirred in you today, titrate it slowly or bring it into conversation. That's where unlearning begins. New episodes drop weekly-ish on Thursdays. You can find me on Instagram at the Unlearning Room Podcast or visit cecilymay.com. Until next time, stay curious and stay kind to the parts of you still learning.